Hi guys, welcome back to Tech Corner. I'm Jay Picasso, and joining me from his own studio today is Shea.
Right.
Today, I'm back in Studio E at Metropolis Studios. So, we're going to be discussing the differences between some hardware racks and their software equivalents. The first bit of hardware that we're going to be looking at today, the TubeTech Equalizer. It provides a rich range of high-end, concentrated and focused mid to highs as well as being known for its delicate treatment of low-end frequencies. Now, like any other hardware or software, there are a large range of EQs. So let's take a look at this one closer and see what makes it so special. This is the TubeTech Program Equalizer PE1B. TubeTech have actually made a few different equalizers using their famous tube hardware. These units were actually designed to work like the famous Pultec equalizers. They have a similar sound and a similar functionality. Now, what's important to know about this unit is that it's actually handmade in Denmark. So it comes with some extremely credible build quality. It also provides you with the Pultec sound without necessarily charging you the premium price for the Pultec unit. So the first thing that we want to look at is this toggle switch here. This determines whether the EQ is actually active or being bypassed. In bypass mode, the filter is taken out, but the amplifier is still engaged. For the low frequencies, you can select 20, 30, 60, or 100, and you've got a shelving type of boost and attenuation. And so for the high frequencies, we can select 1, 1.5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, 12, or 16 kilohertz. Now, the amount of boost on these frequencies is dependent on the bandwidth. Now, you can vary the bandwidth from sharp to broad. It looks great, it sounds great, and it's right here at Metropolis Studios. Now, Shea, take us through the software equivalent.
No problem. So, just as Jay mentioned, I'm going to be going through the Pultec style EQ. Now, in Logic, at the moment here, as you can see, I've just got a drum track. This is a track taken out of Apple Loops. Let's just play it through clean so you can see what we're going to be working with. Cool. Now, in Logic, if we go to the EQ menu, you'll see at the bottom here, we've got something called the Vintage EQ Collection. Now, within this, we have 3 possible EQs. Now, the TubeTech EQ, or the version of the Pultec, the TubeTech one that Jay showed earlier, this is a tube EQ. It has valves inside it, and this is what gives it its nice, thick, warm characteristic. And in Logic, we have something called the Vintage Tube EQ. Obviously, they can't call it a Pultec or a TubeTech because of like copy, just you can't do that. But this is a rendition of that. So if we open this and have a look at the interface, what you can see is pretty much exactly what was in the hardware. If we disregard this section at the bottom, because this is a whole other unit based on the Pultec, this section here is an exact replica layout to what it was in the hardware. Now, if I just open this up a little bit, I'm going to talk you through exactly how these work. So Jay did mention to you that we have a low section and we have a high section. However, these work in a very strange way. So in our low section, which is this triangle, this kind of face, we've got 2 eyes and a mouth, maybe. These bits here, we have a low boost, but we also have a low attenuation. Now, we can pick the frequencies here. On the hardware, it was a click, if you remember from the video. Here, we've got a nice smooth distance. So I can pick an exact frequency that I want to change, whether that's boost or attenuate. Here, the boost is a shelf. So everything from, say, 62 Hertz that we're at the minute, from that point down is a shelving EQ. Now, the higher we boost this is the steeper the Q, or the steeper the slope of that shelf, okay? And it changes, the higher we go, the steeper the curve. Now, with the attenuation, this is slightly different. This isn't a shelf. This is a notch EQ. So what it does is it pulls the frequencies down, but not shelving them from 60 higher, because that would completely impact all of the frequencies above it. So what this does is the low attenuation is a cut. Now what this is, even though it says that it's at 60, it is higher up than 60. So around 60 would be around about 200 or so Hertz. There is an equation that works this out perfectly for you, which you're free to go and look at and research yourselves. However, The low section, even though you have a boost and attenuation, they are different frequencies based around this center frequency. The low is a shelf, which the higher you go, the steeper the curve, and the same with the attenuation. The more you pull it down is the steeper the curve will be. So the tighter the Q will be, okay? We then move to the midsection. This is a bell curve. This you have a bandwidth for. You can pick the frequencies. Again, because it's a plugin, you have a nice smooth distance, so it's not clicked frequency, which is very helpful. And you have a high boost. The attenuation for the high frequency is a shelf. Now this attenuation is 5, 10 or 20 kilohertz on the hardware. However, because it's the plugin, we have the distance here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to, on this drum track, I'm going to go back to 60 hertz. I'm going to lift this by 3 dB, but I'm also going to attenuate it by 2 decibels. Now remember, this is frequencies lower than 60 hertz. 60 hertz and below is getting a nice shelf boost. But now an equation higher than that, or a multiple higher than that, around about the 200 area, we're going to be pulling that down by 2 decibels. If we go to the high band, I'm going to make the width of the band quite wide. I'm going to go to about 3K, and I'm going to lift this by 3 dB. Okay. What I'm going to also do is in the high attenuation, I'm going to keep it at 20 kilohertz, and I'm going to duck this down by a decibel. What this is going to do is it's going to add to that warm character. It's going to just slightly pull down those really high frequencies for me. Now this is at 20K, so this is extremely high in terms of what we can hear. However, it should make a difference. The great thing about the plugin as well is we have this drive section. I'm going to put this up to about halfway. 5.5, the max we can go is 11, so 5.5 is halfway. And it gives us a nice general saturation to the sound. What we would get from the hardware, because they were valves, we can now replicate that with some saturation and drive within the plugin. So I'm going to take this out and then bring it back in to see what we get. And then we're going to level match just to see the difference between them. So let's have a listen without and with. Let it go round once, then we'll put it back in. So we can see now we're getting quite a boost in the volume. Let me pull the actual track down a couple of decibels. So without it, we're at -5. Put it down a couple of dB here, just to compensate for that gain. So it's kind of clean. Once we put this in, it just gets a bit more dirt to it. Let's add a bit more bass to this. Fairly clean. More aggressive. Take that attenuation out. It's a lot thinner, right? You can hear the saturation. Let's add in some more of this drive. Can you see what it adds to the flavour? It's nice and clean without, and this is an Apple loop, remember, so it's very nice sounding to start with. But if we want to get a bit more aggression, a bit more power, a bit more body into the sound, the Pultec style EQ, or the Tube Tech that we saw in the hardware, Logic as stock can give you that with this. At the bottom here, we do have some shelves at the bottom which we can have in or out. What you will find, without changing any volumes here, boost or attenuations, just having the plug-in on with the drive circuit is going to add harmonic distortion to the track. So let's have a listen to that now. Let's take away everything here. So we're not boosting anything or cutting anything. All we're doing is adding some saturation here. So let's have a listen to this. Put this back to normal. You can hear how much thickness. So if you want some nice saturation, you can just model those valves from the hardware using this drive circuit. So back to Jay, let's talk about the next piece of equipment we're going to emulate.
Up next, hardware unit number 2 is the 1176, a compressor. This piece of kit is one of the most prolific compressors of all time in the music industry. Its contribution to music has been over countless hits. Musicians, producers, and engineers have used this compressor throughout history on a variety of instruments, ranging from the human voice to guitar all the way to drums. The 1176 finds itself home in thousands of studios across the world. It's often referred to as the engineer's go-to compressor, often because of the dynamic range that it supplies. The very fact that you can neatly compress all these types of sound through this one unit suggests that it really has found its rightful place in history. So let's take a look. The 1176, the producer's compressor and limiter. Let's get into what it actually does, shall we? First of all, we have this input knob. Now this input knob has a simple purpose, to measure how much gain is actually going into the compressor. Simple. Next to it, we have our master output knob, which of course is determining how much volume is actually leaving the compressor limiter. Next to that, we have the attack and release buttons. The attack determines how quickly the compressor responds to transients, and the release knob will determine how quickly the volume returns back to 0. Now, both of these knobs go from 1 to 7, 1 being the slowest, 7 being the quickest. Now, next to these, we have our ratio. What you really need to know about ratio at this stage is that it really tells us how aggressive the compression will be. Shea, give us the software equivalent, bro.
Sweet, thanks Jay. So we're looking at the 1176. This is a classic compressor. Just like Jay mentioned, it is used on countless records for recording and mixing purposes. Now we're going to be using that on our EQ drums right now. So just before, if you remember, we looked at the Pultec EQ and I applied a few little changes to it. We backed it down and just used the drive, the distortion here. I'm going to push this back up a little bit just to give it a bit more body. We're going to compensate a decibel because we're probably going to be adding a bit with all of this stuff. So it sounds really nice. It sounds nice and bodyful. It's got a bit of energy added to it from the valve saturation and stuff and the low boost. But now I'm going to open up in Logic's stock dynamics plugin, the compressor. Instead of being on this standard platinum digital one, which is just a nice, clean, sterile, all-round compressor for Logic, we're going to go to the vintage FET. Now, if you look at this, it looks a lot like the hardware, the silver face. We do have a studio FET, the black face here. This one is an 1176 again, however, it's just a different revision. Revision meaning it was out at a later date. The original, the vintage FET, this is the one that was in the studio, in Studio E at Metropolis. So, how this works, Jay mentioned. We've got an input drive, we have here, the input gain. We have a ratio. The difference here is we've got all of these possibilities instead of just the buttons that you can push in. We've got a threshold, which you don't have on the original one. The threshold is basically part of the input, how much you drive into it. We have a knee control, and we have the standard attack and release times. So let's mess around with this a little bit and see what we can get. This is a classic drum compressor. This is used on drums a lot. This is also used for parallel processing, which I'll show after this. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go to the graph and see where our volume's coming in. At the moment, we are at 0 threshold, so nothing should be compressing, really. We shouldn't be getting any gain reduction. We're at about minus 2.6 here. So let's bring this down to about minus 10. Cool. Further down. Cool. So we're getting really into those transients now. Let's slow the attack up so we can let those transients through and make the release a lot faster. Now we can afford to get higher in the ratio. Cool. Without. See, we've gone down in gain a bit there. We can make up that gain reduction. Pretty nice. Maybe a longer release so it holds on to it for a bit longer. This is where we can hear the tone of that FET style compressor. See, now it's held it down quite hard and we're quite low in volume here, so we can afford to push it back up. Kind of losing the transients there. Pull the release back. So there, you can hear it's getting a bit loud, so let's compensate on the output gain here. So the output volume of the overall plugin. You can hear just the aggression. Bit faster on the attack. Starts to suck the life out of it a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is bounce this in place. The reason for doing this is just so we can see this as a visual representation to what the compressor is doing. Okay, so bounce this in place. We're going to leave the original one in, just so we can actually see what it's doing. Now look, this compared to this, the difference between each of the transients in these, you can see the transients are a lot quieter on these second hits compared to the first one. If I put these in and we just look at this section here, if we just go a bit smaller, so we're looking at one file instead, you can see here the distance and the thickness generated from the compression. Here it's a bit more sporadic. Here we've got longer for louder because of that compression characteristic. Now this means that the dynamic range is going to be less, so we've got less distance from loudest to quietest, which means the quieter stuff, the background noises, the tails of all the other drums, as well as mainly the cymbals that are running in sort of the room mic sound is going to be louder. So let's mute and bypass. So we've got the original here, and then we've got a version that's got the EQ and the compression on. So let's hear the original. Cool, EQ and compressed version. So much more energy. It has gone up a couple of decibels in volume, but the character and the tone of that sound is now a completely different energy. It's more aggressive, it's thicker, it sounds a bit more vintage sounding, and if that's what you want to go for, Logic has got you covered with stock plugins. One other thing that I did mention before was parallel compression. So let's get rid of the bounced version. We're going to put the EQ in. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this off to an auxiliary track, to a bus. And I'm going to drag and drop this compressor over to that bus. We're going to turn the compressor on. Now on here, I'm going to absolutely obliterate this track. Okay, it's going to be fairly fast attack, fairly fast release, and I'm going to send all of it to the compressor. So basically what I'm doing now is I'm sending my EQ'd signal off, making a copy of it and sending it off to this compressor to get absolutely smashed and obliterated. Let's listen to what that sounds like on its own. Ready? Not ideal for an actual drum track. This would be not the best idea to put on the track in series because it would ruin the sound of the drums. However, if I pull this down, we hear the original and I bring this in underneath. Without it, not that much energy. With it, really hard compression here. Without it. So what we're doing here is we're using the characteristics of a FET, which sounds like this. Dirty, distorted, not very nice. Let's turn the volume up a bit. Really horrible sounding, but we're adding that in to the signal of the original clean one. So this is a great trick for using coming out of a verse section into a chorus. What you can do is just have the version of that track sent off to a parallel compressor like the 1176, which is absolutely smashed. And then when the chorus comes in, so let's play 2 bars as a verse, we'll bring this in for the chorus and just see how much energy gets lifted in to the chorus. And remember, this is nothing to do with the original track. We're not altering the tone of the original. We're just adding a version that's a mess underneath it. So ready? Verse, getting ready to go to the chorus. Here we go. So much more energy, forward, back to verse. And there we have it. The 1176, a classic compressor. I use it a lot for vocals. It's a lovely vocal compressor. At the moment, we're using it in its intended use, in most cases, modern day, which is to smash things and make things sound a bit dirtier and grittier, being a FET style compressor. But for smoother kind of compression, longer release times. If I hold the release time longer on this, not as splashy. See, it just holds it down, look. Release time out. That's where you get that smash, splash. Or that, held, solid. Without. Okay. With more energy. Sweet.
So to conclude from me, hardware will always have its place. Generally speaking, the argument is more quality is achieved through a piece of hardware versus software. Sometimes the limitation of software is the fact that you're actually using a computer chip to do the work of a £1,000, £2,000 piece of equipment. It's never necessarily going to measure up. Having said that, the results achieved today by these software versions cannot be denied. So, if you do have access to a big studio, make sure that you are actually having a go with these things. I know producers who get so attached to working in the box that even when they're surrounded by all of this equipment and this multitude of sound quality bending materials, they still choose to operate in the box. There's nothing wrong with that. But I would argue that exploration should always be top of the agenda for a producer. So if you are around this equipment, be sure to give it a go. It's just the same as using the software. The only difference is now and again you might need to know something about signal routing. But we can do that in a different session. Cheers guys, take care, have a good week, peace.